Hi, this is Matthew Lawrence, and today we're going to be talking about this beautiful interview with Cheryl Strayed and Pico Iyer, which is found on a podcast. We're going to send you the link. So if you haven't had a chance yet to listen to the podcast, you'll still get a lot out of this class, even if you haven't, because we're going to be going over the essentials of the interview. But if you want to listen to it first and then come back to this video, that would work as well. So we'll see you in a few. Thank you to those of you who have been hanging in there with these videos and watching a kind of learning curve. It's pretty steep. Hopefully we're getting the hang of this a little bit. I want you to know that beginning next week, we're going to switch to a Zoom format because a Zoom will give us a chance to interact with one another. And if you're not able to get into the Zoom meeting while it's happening, the recording of that meeting will be posted so that you can still be a part of it. We're interested today in the Cheryl Strayed interview of Pico Iyer, this wonderful interview, and we're going to talk a little bit about it now. I'm interested in how this interview reveals the ground of reality that we're all participating in, whether that ground of reality is revealed through contemplative practice or sometimes simply through the moments of sudden, brilliant insight that we sometimes have in our lives. That ground of reality is revealed to us. And so we're going to explore that a little bit with Pico Iyer and Cheryl Strayed. The sort of overall context for this that I would encourage us to remember is that wonderful quote by Evelyn Underhill, that she said, "Mysticism is the art of union with reality." Or I would say, using a more contemporary version, contemplative practice is the art of union with reality. Certainly, the question is for us, what is our reality now, right? Strayed and Iyer give us some clues to that right now. So let's jump into it a little bit. But before we do, I wanted to just briefly mention also this quite important, I think, and beautifully done podcast put out by the New York Times called The Daily. And on April 20th, The Daily did an interview with Donald McNeil, who is a science reporter for the New York Times, and who early on during this crisis was predicting exactly how it was going to unfold. And all of his predictions proved to be true. And so they go back to him on April 20th to ask, what are you seeing coming up along in the near future? And what was very sobering was his report that those of us who think this is all going to go back to normal, say in May or in July or in August, we're just fooling ourselves. That when you look at the science and you look at the numbers, we're in this for a while. And we have to adjust to that reality now. He says that the world record for developing a vaccine was 4 years. It took 4 years to develop a vaccine for the mumps outbreak. People are now saying we might be able to get a vaccine in 18 months. That is not proven. And we're not going to be completely safe until we do have a vaccine. And in the meantime, we have to practice this discipline of what he calls the hammer and the dance. The hammer is lockdown. The hammer is complete physical distancing. The hammer is quarantine when necessary. The hammer is just doing everything we can to prevent the spread of the virus. And then the dance is when we take small steps to introduce normal reality, normal interaction, just a little bit at a time to see how it goes. And that, we won't know what happens when we do that until 3 weeks later, because it'll take 3 weeks for the virus to begin its spread again. So you might open a couple of restaurants, wait 3 weeks to see how it goes, and then if it goes okay, you can loosen things up a little bit more. But it may well be that we take a few steps toward loosening, and then we find out, you know what, we have to go back to the hammer. So this dance, the hammer and the dance, is going to be a part of our lives for some time now, and we need to adjust to that. How does that affect you in your spiritual life and in your prayer life and in your relationship with God and with the ground of all being? One of the things that reminds us is that the permanent state of being is impermanence, right? To use that Buddhist phrase. We can be sure that whatever happens, it's a fluid situation for some time. And that in the meantime, we are living in a reality of uncertainty, ambiguity, dread, grief, loss, anger, and also moments of peace, moments of deep connection and insight, moments of revelation, perhaps. So as we contemplate that, as we think about that, and then we turn toward this beautiful interview of Pico Iyer by Cheryl Strayed, our own Portland Cheryl Strayed. They begin by talking about the cherry blossoms in Japan and how the cherry blossoms can be a reminder of impermanence. They only last for a little while they're blooming, and we are seeing that in Portland now. The cherry blossoms are in full bloom, or maybe just a little past their peak. It reminds us that life is about joyful participation in a world of sorrow. I think it was Pico Iyer who put it in those terms. Its impermanence gives us reason to find our beauty and joy right now, because right now the blossoms are out, right? So bringing us into the present moment is in a way that rewards us with this incredible glimpse of beauty. That's our reward right now. I know that, I don't know about you, but I have been able to get out for walks every day, keeping 6 feet away from everyone else, wearing a mask. And boy, the last few days have been extraordinarily gorgeous, haven't they been? And I'm so grateful for that this virus comes at a time when, at the very least, we can take some time to appreciate the beauty of this world. Going along with that theme of impermanence, Pico Iyer talks about the forest fire that burned down his house and everything in it and changed his life. He lost everything, including what he thought of at the time as his vocation, his writing, because all of his notes were written in longhand and were burned up. All of his writing, everything he had been working on, was gone. But then he realized that maybe this is the chance to get a little perspective on his life. Maybe this is the chance to live his life a little differently. He says that fire reduced me to nothing, forced me to think about what I care about and actually sharpen my priorities to make possible my life now. He talked about how he realized he didn't need everything that he owned. In fact, his possessions were just weighing him down. And it gave him kind of a permission to explore his life on new terms, terms that have led him to his current place. It's so beautiful. And then Cheryl reflected on how, when she teaches writing, she asks her students to write about the most important lessons of their life. And she said, inevitably, they're writing about the hardest thing, the deepest, most painful wounds, the times when they lost everything. And she said, what's always true about that is we wouldn't have wished these experiences on our worst enemies, but they are always the things that teach us the most. It's the nature of this impermanent reality. So this is not about a sentimental silver lining. This is not about pretending that, everything's going to be great someday and just hang in there. It's not about God doesn't give us anything that we can't handle. It is not the case that all suffering is necessarily redeemed. But it is the case that when we are suffering, we really have only one way through it, and that is through it, right? Being present to the ground of reality is the only way that we develop the skills and the ability, the perspective to get through it. And the contemplative life is all about being open to what is in the present moment. Recognizing that when our fear is rising up, when we're projecting all kinds of horrible scenarios that are not in existence right now, when we live in panic mode, we're actually depriving ourselves of the peace of this moment, the present ground of reality. What is that present ground of reality for you right now? Makes me think about McNeil Jr. and her beautiful book, When Things Fell Apart. When things fell apart in my life, a good friend of mine, whose name is Bill Lupfer, suggested I read this book by McNeil Jr. And I'm so glad I did. She says, things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen. Room for grief, room for relief, for misery, for joy. When we think that something is going to bring us pleasure, we don't know what's really going to happen. When we think something is going to give us misery, we don't know. Letting there be room for not knowing is the most important thing of all. When there's a big disappointment, we don't know if that's the end of the story. It may be just the beginning of a great adventure. McNeil Jr. goes on to say, I read somewhere about a family who had only one son. They were very poor. The son was extremely precious to them, and the only thing that mattered to his family was that he bring them some financial support and prestige. Then he was thrown from a horse and crippled. It seemed like the end of their lives. 2 weeks after that, the army came into the village and took away all the healthy, strong men to fight in the war. And this young man was allowed to stay behind and take care of his family. Life is like that. We don't know anything. We call something bad, we call it good, but we just don't know. If I'm not mistaken, I think that story that McNeil Jr. was referring to is a story told by the Buddha, a whole series of events that take place that on the face of it, at first it seems horrible, but then it turns out, oh, actually that was salvific for the family. And then another terrible thing happens, but actually, oh, if that hadn't happened, this wouldn't have happened, which is a really good thing. And so it is. Life takes its ebbs and its flows. How can we stay in this not knowing place? That's the question. There's something in us that wants to just say, stop. Let me just believe that what is going to be good is going to be good. And it's going to be good forever. How do I adjust to this constantly flowing reality? Right? How do I make my peace with that? How do I find peace in that? Right? It makes me think about those expert roller coaster riders, which is not me, by the way. When I'm on a roller coaster, I'm like holding on. But there are those who are really skilled at roller coaster riding, and you watch them as they go up and over, and they're going whee, and experiencing that weightlessness for a moment as the car goes over the hill. I don't know how they do that. I don't have the courage for that. I always think I'm going to get flown out. I just do. But in a way, isn't that what contemplative practice is? It's a letting go. Even in the midst of it all, the highs and the lows, it's a letting go. Crazy, difficult. It takes practice. This is why we sit every day. So there's good news and bad news, right? The bad news is that there is no permanence. And the good news is, actually, that's okay. Actually, as we deepen our relationship with the ground of reality, the ground and abyss of reality, as Paul Tillich put it, defining God, we begin to tap into our deepest joy. Not our joy, actually, the joy that is found in reality itself. When my life was in crisis and everything was falling apart, I said to a friend, it feels like I'm in free fall. I'm in free fall. And I've let go of everything. And he said, yeah, this is the good news and the bad news. The bad news is we're in free fall. But the good news is there's no ground that we're going to smash into. As we practice that free fall state, we begin to really discover the nature of reality itself. So this leads me to a slight little bit of a caution, which is that in some of the kind of writing and YouTube videos and other things that are being offered out there these days, there's sort of a movement happening among some of the contemplative or, mystical people that, seems to think that this is a big awakening into some new era of being, that we're going to break through into some new reality together. There's kind of this dream of an idealized state, a permanent idealized state. That finally, this crisis is going to lead us to finally learn how to cooperate as a species, how to listen to one another, how to have compassion, maybe have a decent healthcare system in this country, all kinds of beautiful dreams arising out of it. Well, maybe, but the one thing that we kind of recognize is things go in waves. The Christian tendency has always been to dream of a time when the kingdom of God has arrived as a permanent blissful state. But the reality of our lives up to this point has been accommodating ourselves to the constant state of flux. And I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. The Great Depression gave rise to the New Deal. That was wonderful. At least in my opinion, that was wonderful. But did it fix everything? Did it solve everything? Certainly not. Pico Iyer goes on to say, we have much less power over the world than we imagine. We have much more power over how we respond to the world than we suspect. Our responses to circumstance define us much more than the circumstances themselves. It's such a helpful reminder, isn't it? Really, we have the power to choose how we will respond to this crisis. We have the power to open ourselves to that reality and be flexible and open and creative and engaged. We don't have to tense up. We don't have to, even in the face of death, we can say, Alleluia, right? He says, I'm not powerless. When people go into these dark places, they often come back with wonderful gifts. And Pico Iyer reminds us of the Hindu cosmos, which includes Shiva, the god of destruction, as well as creation, right? I do not know almost anything about Hinduism, but I've always noted that, contrary to Christianity, which tends to put destruction outside the realm of God except for righteous judgment, in Hinduism, the cycles of destruction are seen as divine action just as much as the cycles of creation. I don't know what to think of that as a Christian. I'm not saying I'm endorsing that point of view necessarily, but I will say that whether something that's happening in this world is good or bad is really a matter of my own perspective. Whether something is destructive or creative, are they not just two sides of the same coin? That there's a certain amount of destruction necessary for anything new to be born. In fact, our own deaths may be good news to the planet. You know? So where is God on all of this? Maybe God is in the moment of embrace of reality itself. Maybe God is in that moment when we as mortal beings recognize our own death and say, Alleluia. Right? So we have it in ourselves to cut the vicious cycle. Pico Iyer says, just stop. And ask yourself now, what are your priorities? How will you get your life in balance? We have the power now for that conversation. Thank you to Claudia, who sent in a very interesting little reflection by Jan Phillips. Jan Phillips, who's apparently, I don't know her, but a spiritual speaker, motivational speaker, does a lot of workshops and retreats and things. Anyway, she sent out this interesting message about this time, and what we can expect out of this time, and how we interpret this time. And she posed it in terms of male and female voices. He says, we must conquer it and return to normal. She says, a door to the new has creaked open. The ways of the past led to ruin. He says, God will stop the spread of this suffering. He will hear our prayers and take mercy. She says, we are the hands and feet of that one. It is our time to create a just world. I found that very helpful and interesting. I just offer it to you for your consideration. That maybe the male part of our brains, the fix-it part of our brains, the part of our brains that wants to control reality, is linked into this traditional, relatively orthodox Christian view that says, we got to take control of this. While our female side of our brains is saying, wait a minute, there's a new reality that we're opening to. And it's up to us now. I love this story about Leonard Cohen that Pico Iyer tells. Apparently Pico Iyer knew Leonard Cohen quite well and reflects on Leonard Cohen's life as a monk in a Zen community for 5 years. Beautiful story. Here's this rock star who could choose any life he wanted, life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And instead, he's spending his time meditating and sweeping the kitchen and driving his master around, his teacher around. He calls Leonard Cohen a professional at the art of living, and describes his time as a monk as the voluptuous adventure of his life. He describes Leonard Cohen as the wisest, kindest, least impressed by himself person I've ever met, other than maybe the Dalai Lama. And I love that description, the least impressed by himself person he's ever met. I want to talk about that a little bit as we talk about this invitation that this time is bringing to us. What is it about humility that speaks to us about holiness? Pico Iyer travels with the Dalai Lama to the tsunami site in Japan, and while he's talking to these school children, he reflects on his own life as a child when he realizes he has to go into exile, leave behind everything he's ever known, and spend days crossing these mountains on foot to get to safety, and leaving behind for the rest of his life in Tibet. They say loss is an equal opportunity employer. Loss helps us reach toward others. The best cure for anxiety is thinking of others, because we're not caught up in our own agendas then. Our thoughts can turn to other people better. In that way, loss is a way in which the ground of reality wells up in us and connects us to everyone else who's ever experienced loss, as the Dalai Lama connected to those kids over his experience of loss. The ground of reality teaches us that as we connect one to the other over the experience of loss, what do we discover there? Love. And they remind us that the more powerful we are, the more humble we must be, quoting Pope Francis. I'll never forget when Pope Francis, the first days after his consecration as Pope, how he was washing the feet of the poor and the oppressed. This need that we all have to let go of any sense of having magical powers. The example the Pope gives us, or the Dalai Lama gives us, when they say, I too am surrendering. When the Dalai Lama is asked a question about marriage, for example, and he laughs uproariously and says, what are you asking me about marriage? I don't know about marriage. I'm a celibate monk. I'm not a magic man. I'm not an all-knowing being, right? I'm just a monk. I'm just another human being. And in that, he's surrendering. What is he surrendering? Ego, right? Delusion, pride, the opportunity to be seen as something other than what he is. What is it that we are surrendering when we go toward humility, toward the ground of our own humility? Cheryl goes on then to talk about that. That's an incredible story about her car accident. They're driving in the winter in Minnesota toward Madeline Island. I know that road well. I've been on it many times myself. And it's in the middle of winter, and they're driving down this highway, and suddenly this car is spinning out of control. I've been there too. And she's saying, we got to get control. We got to get control. Get control of the car. Get control of the car. And then she feels the car go airborne. And suddenly they turn to one another, she and her husband. And this moment of panic gives way to a moment of peaceful presence. This need for control gives way to peaceful presence. And in that moment, they both turn to one another, and they just, right away, they say, I love you, before they make impact. In that moment, she says, we only wanted to say, we love you one more time. What is that if not a revelation of the ground of love, discovered in weightlessness, in free fall, if you will, when we go back to our very essence of love, to that which connects us all, which is love and death. In the presence of death, we proclaim our love. Isn't that amazing and gorgeous? I love that story. It reminds me of a time when I was in a similar situation, winter in Minnesota. I was in the passenger seat. My brother Chris was driving. My cello was in the back seat. I was on my way to an audition, and my brother's best friend was in the back seat as well. Going around a curve, and we got hit by this tanker truck. And we banged into the guardrail on our left, and then we're all crumpled in our seats, careening across the highway. And I remembered something that my gym teacher told me in that moment. My gym teacher had done a class about alcoholism as part of our, health class. And he had said, there's an interesting fact, which is that when police are called to the scene of an accident where a drunk driver was in the accident, they find out that drunk drivers are killed less often than other people in the same accident. And why is that? It's because they're so drunk that their bodies are really relaxed. And when they make that impact, the relaxation of their bodies makes it so that the impact is less injurious to them. There's something about tightening up that means that you're going to be injured very badly, worse off, than if you go into that impact relaxed. And so I remembered that as the car I was in was careening out of control. I remembered that, and I just went, and my whole body went limp. And half a second later, boom, we impacted the bridge abutment on the other side of the highway. The ambulance driver, when he got to us, he found that we all survived even though none of us had seatbelts on. My cello was destroyed, rigidly built as it was. But we were all okay except for a big gash in my lip. And the ambulance driver said that that advice that my gym teacher had given us might have saved my life. At any rate, one thing that those moments reveal to us is that in the present moment, we have far more power than we know. And that power is ironically found in releasing all power and becoming one with what is. And in that moment, love is revealed. So I want to invite you to consider that truth. You know, we're like the pebble that loves the mountain, recognizing its source and its substance. Yeah. Or we're like a raindrop that is falling toward the ocean, recognizing its source and its substance. And as it recognizes itself in the ocean, it loves the ocean as it falls toward it and disappears into the ocean on impact. We are made of God. We are of the substance of God. We are in free fall toward God. And as we enter into that free fall, we recognize that we are the being, the ground, and the abyss in a nutshell. And one day we will fully dissolve and be released into nothingness, which is everythingness. And we can participate in that now. Letting go. Feet on the ground, butt in the seat. Strong back, soft front. You are in free fall. And there is no ground except for love. Thank you. Have a blessed week. And just a reminder, if you want to join our Zoom meeting next week, again, we're switching from YouTube to Zoom next week. We want to get you, your email address so that we can send you the link for the Zoom meeting. So if you are not on our Trinity Contemplatives email list, and would like to be, because that's what we'll use to get the Zoom meeting link out, please email me your email address and we'll make sure you're on the list, okay? So to do that, email me at matthew@trinity-episcopal.org, and that address is up on your screen. Thank you so much, and blessings.